Welcome to Nightfall Tales. Take a slow, gentle breath in and softly let it go. Settle into your bed or favorite chair. Gently close your eyes and let your body relax. As you unwind, I'd love to know where you're listening from, your city or country. Down in the comments. It's so comforting to feel this quiet. Let my voice carry you softly to a place where imagination wanders and calm dreams begin. The snow had been falling since late afternoon, and by the time evening settled its blue-grey weight upon the village, the world outside Elara's cottage had grown so hushed, so thoroughly muffled in white, that the only sounds left to the night were the ones that lived within these walls, the slow crackle of the fire, the patient hiss of the kettle at the edge of the hearth, the faint, dry rustle of the herb bundles hanging from the ceiling beams like sleeping guests, swaying sometimes in the warmth of the room's breath. Elara sat at her work table, as she had sat on 1,000 such evenings, her hands moving among the familiar shapes of her stores, jars of pale glass and amber, stoppered with cork and sealed with beeswax, stood in their careful rows along the shelves, chamomile and lavender, rosemary and lemon balm, valerian root and dried elderberry, each labelled in her small, precise hand. The firelight moved across them, as it always moved across them, finding first one and then another, so that the whole room seemed to breathe and shimmer with a gentle amber intelligence, as though the plants themselves were aware of the night and the snow and the old woman who kept their secrets. The cottage smelled, as it always smelled, of dried flowers and wood smoke, and something older beneath both, a green-rooted smell that had soaked into the stones of the walls and the grain of the wooden beams over decades of use. It was a smell that Elara no longer noticed, the way a river does not notice its own moving, but which newcomers to the cottage always paused at the door to breathe, their faces softening as though they had, without knowing it, already begun to be helped. The fire whispered on the hearth, the herbs dreamed in their bundles. The snow hushed the world outside. Elara reached for the mortar and pestle, worn smooth with years of use, the stone warm from proximity to the fire, and drew it toward her, though she had not yet decided what she would grind this evening. Sometimes the hands knew before the mind. She turned the pestle in the bowl, feeling the familiar weight of it, the familiar rhythm, and let her eyes move slowly around the room as they so often did in these quiet hours, cataloguing, remembering, resting on this jar, and then that one with the mild proprietary pleasure of a woman who has spent her life in the company of growing things and knows each of them as a friend. It was the inventory time of year. She did this only once, in the deep heart of winter, when the garden slept under its coverlet of frost, and there was no gathering to be done, only the existing stores to be examined, sorted, and assessed. It was a task she had performed for decades, ever since she had taken over the cottage from her grandmother, who had performed it in her own way, in this same room, before the same fire that had burned in this same hearth since the cottage was built. The inventory was not simply a practical matter, though it was that too, checking the seals, noting what was low, what needed to be replenished come spring. It was also a kind of reckoning, a yearly settling of accounts with the green world. She began, as she always began, at the lowest shelf on the left, where the most frequently used jars lived. The chamomile, the lemon balm, the lavender, these she took down one by one, holding each to the firelight to check the colour and integrity of the contents, testing the seal with a gentle pressure of her thumb, wiping the outside of each jar with a soft cloth before returning it to its place. Her hands moved slowly, deliberately, with the unhurried care of a woman who has long since learned that patience is not merely a virtue, but a practice. The chamomile was good. The lemon balm too. The lavender was low. She would need to gather more come July if the summer was warm and the bees were willing. She worked her way along the first shelf, and then the second, and then the third, letting the fire and the snow and the quiet companionship of the room hold her in their patient embrace. The snow had taken everything outside. The world had narrowed itself to this warm room, this circle of firelight, these jars with their sleeping contents and their neat labels. This old woman with her worn hands moving slowly through the inventory of a life's work. The kettle hissed softly. The fire whispered on the hearth. The silence held its ancient patience. By the time she reached the fourth shelf, the one that required her to rise and fetch the small wooden step, stool she kept for the purpose, the light outside the cottage windows had fully surrendered to night. Elara climbed carefully onto the step. Stool, her knees registering the familiar complaint she had come to think of, simply as conversation, the body reminding her that it knew the count of her years even when she did not think of them. She steadied herself with one hand against the shelf and began taking down the jars from this higher row, the less commonly used things, the seasonal preparations, the stock she kept for the less frequent complaints that came to her door. Here was the yarrow, good for fever. Here the dried berries of the hawthorn, good for the aging heart. Here the comfrey, for bruises and slow, healing wounds. She took each one down, examined it, returned it, working from left to right with the same methodical patience she brought to all things. She was nearly at the end of the shelf, nearly at the right-hand corner where it met the wall, when her hand, reaching back into the dimness, beyond the last labelled jar, encountered something unexpected. Glass ajar she had not reached for, had not planned for, had not remembered placing here. She drew it forward into the light. It was small, smaller than most of her jars, and the glass was a deep, dark blue. Not the pale amber or clear glass of her other containers, but a blue so deep it was almost black, the colour of the sky at the very last moment before it surrenders entirely to night. She did not recognize it. She turned it slowly in her hands, searching her memory for the occasion of its acquisition, and found nothing. Her memory was still reliable. She had not yet reached the age at which she distrusted it, and she was certain she had not bought this jar, had not placed it here, had not sealed it with the dark red wax that closed its cork stopper. Wax so old it had hardened and taken on the slightly grainy texture of something long settled into permanence. Inside, visible through the dark glass when she held it close to the firelight, she could see dried petals, very dark crimson, she thought at first, but then tilting the jar closer to black. Whatever flower they had come from, she could not say. She knew the dried petals of a great many flowers, by sight and by scent, and by the way they held their colour over time. But these she did not recognize. They lay loosely in the jar, as though placed there with great care. One by one, she was still holding the blue jar, still turning it slowly in her hands, when her fingers found the paper beneath the shelf, not beneath the jar exactly, but tucked into the joint where the shelf met the wall, wedged there as though placed deliberately, as though hidden not from discovery, but simply from accident. She worked it free carefully, for it was clearly old, clearly fragile, and her hands knew how to handle fragile things. It was a piece of parchment, folded twice, yellowed to the colour of old cream, the edges softened with age. She stepped down from the stool and carried both the jar and the parchment to the work table, into the full warmth of the firelight, before she unfolded it. The handwriting she recognized before she had read a single word. The recognition moved through her like a slow, warm current, not surprising, not startling, but settling, the way a missing piece settles into the place in a puzzle that was always prepared to receive it. She had grown up with that handwriting. She had learned to read from it, spent her girlhood tracing its careful letters, following it across pages of plant names and harvesting notes, and the careful records her grandmother kept of all who came seeking help. The hand was her grandmother's. The woman had been gone for 30 years, and yet here was her writing, waiting. The note was brief, 5 words only, and then a period. The period firm and deliberate, placed there like a full stop, not only on the sentence but on some longer thought that the 5 words contained. For the one who will know what to do with sorrow. Elara stood very still. The fire whispered on the hearth. The snow hushed the world outside. She read the words again, and then again, her lips moving slightly as they sometimes did when she was reading something she wanted to feel, as well as understand, something that required not just the eyes but the mouth and the breath. For the one who will know what to do with sorrow. The period at the end was precise. There was no signature. There was no explanation. Her grandmother had never been a woman who over-explained. She set the note down carefully on the work table and turned the blue jar in her hands again, holding it closer to the firelight. The petals inside shifted slightly with the motion, dark and dry and still, and when she tilted the jar, a thin stream of scent reached her. Barely anything, just the ghost of a fragrance, finding its way around the edge of the wax seal. And she breathed it in slowly, paying it full attention. It was dark, complex, not sweet, not in the way of lavender or chamomile. It had layers, the way deep woods have layers when you stand very still. First the surface, which was floral, dark and rich, like roses left too long in a vase, and then beneath that something earthier, a scent of soil and root and depth, and then beneath even that something she had no name for, a quality that was less a smell than a sensation, a feeling of standing at the edge of something very large and very quiet. She held that breath for a long moment. Then she let it out slowly, and stood looking at the jar with the expression she reserved for things she did not yet understand, not worried, not frustrated, but attentive, the way a student is attentive to a teacher whose lesson has not yet become fully clear. Her grandmother 30 years gone, and yet here was her hand, her jar, her fragrance, her words, for the one who will know what to do with sorrow. She carried the jar and the note to her chair by the fire, the worn chair she had sat in for decades, its cushions shaped by years of her particular weight, and the particular way she held herself, fitting her now the way old things fit, without accommodation, without adjustment, as a natural home. She lowered herself into it slowly, the blue jar held in both hands, and let the firelight have its way with the room. The herbs dreamed in their bundles overhead. The fire whispered on the hearth. The silence held its ancient patience. She thought of her grandmother, not the grandmother of the last years, the one she had watched grow slow and careful and finally still, but the grandmother of her girlhood, the tall woman with the long grey braid who had moved through this same room with an ease and authority that had seemed, to Elara watching from the low stool in the corner, as natural as breathing. That woman had known everything, or so it had seemed. She had known which plant flowered in shade, and which required full sun, which root could be harvested in autumn, and which lost its virtue if not gathered in spring, which tea calmed a troubled stomach, and which, made from the flowers that bloomed only a week in midsummer, would ease the breathing of a child with the croup. She had known these things not from books, though there were books, but from a lifetime of attention, of being answered by the plants themselves, who told their stories in colour and scent and the particular way a leaf dried or a root resisted the knife. She had taught Elara all of it, or all that could be taught, the names, common and Latin and older still, passed down through generations too long and quiet to have been written, the phases of the moon and which plants honoured them, the particular way sorrow showed itself in the body, in the tightness of the shoulders, in the dullness of the eyes, and what could be offered for each manifestation. She had been a woman who knew about sorrow, not abstractly, but in her hands, in the long memory of having sat with it many times. She had buried 2 children before they reached adulthood. She had buried a husband. She had sat with the dying, and with those whose grief was so old it had become simply the texture of their daily life. She had known what to give them always, and yet she had left this jar unlabeled. Elara turned the blue glass slowly in her hands, feeling its weight, its coolness against her palms, the slight roughness of the old wax seal, for the one who will know what to do with sorrow. Not for the treatment of sorrow, not for sorrow's ease simply, for the one who will know what to do with it. The distinction was small and enormous at once. The way such distinctions often were, a single word shifted, and the meaning of the whole thing shifted with it. The way a single degree of change in the preparation of a remedy could alter its action entirely. She thought of the people who had come to her over the years with sorrow, the widow from the upper lane, who had come first in the weeks after her husband's death, her face hollowed out with grief, and then again and again over the years since. Elara had given her valerian for sleep, lemon balm for the trembling nerves, and later chamomile tea simply to sit over, something warm to hold in the hands while she talked or while she was quiet, not a cure. There was no cure for a husband 30 years married and suddenly gone, but a series of small shelters, small offerings to the body so the body could hold what the heart was working through. The young man who had come 2 winters past, his face shuttered, his eyes fixed somewhere slightly to the left of whoever he was speaking to. She had known without being told that his grief was the kind that does not announce itself in tears, the kind that settles into the muscles and makes everything heavy. She gave him what he asked for, a warming blend for the cold in his chest, but also a small packet of dried rose petals for the bath, letting him think it was for the skin. It was for something older than the skin. The child who had come with her father, neither of them speaking of the mother, the absence between them so solid and particular that Elara moved carefully around it. A gentle tea for poor sleep, a tincture for the father's headaches, and at the door you are welcome here whenever you need to come. She could not fix what they carried. She could make a space where it was allowed to exist. This was what she had done. This was what she had always done. She had known at some level below words that sorrow was not an illness to be treated, but something with its own necessity, its own work to do in the people who carried it. She had helped them carry it. She had made the carrying more possible. She had held the sorrow with them, not cured it. Her grandmother had known it. She turned the thought slowly, the way you turn a stone to see what lives beneath. Had known it before she died, had prepared this lesson in advance, had placed this jar and this note in trust for the day when the right hands would find them, for the one who will know what to do with sorrow. Not for any herbalist who finds this, for the one who will know the weight of it settled into her, quiet and complete, the way a deep truth settles when it is recognized, not with surprise, because the truth has always been present, but with the relief of acknowledgement. Her grandmother had looked across the decades and found her here, in this chair, in this firelight, and had said, You are the one." She sat with that for a long time. The fire whispered on the hearth. The herbs dreamed in their bundles. Outside, the snow went on falling, hushing the world, pressing the cottage further into its own warmth and fragrance. She thought about sorrow as a thing in itself. What was it, the shadow of love? She had known that for a long time, proved it to herself through observation. You cannot grieve what you did not love. The grief was the love with nowhere to go, and so it turned inward, circled back, settled into the body and the long architecture of a life. To cure sorrow, if such a thing were possible, which she had always doubted, would be to cure the love that caused it. And who would want that? Number the sorrow was the record, the proof, the continuing presence of the person or the thing that was gone, living on in the ache of the one who remained. You did not cure it, you learned to carry it. And sometimes you grew strong enough in the carrying that you barely noticed the weight, and sometimes the weight returned all at once. A smell, a light, a particular quality of morning. And you sat with it again, as familiar as an old companion, and let it have its time. Her grandmother had carried sorrow. Her grandmother had known what Elara had spent decades slowly understanding, and she had left this jar as a kind of recognition. I knew this, and you know it too. And now you know that I knew that you would know it. The fire whispered on the hearth. Elara held the blue jar and let the recognition settle. After a time, she could not have said how long, but the fire had burned somewhat lower, and the room had taken on the slightly deeper hush of the later evening. She rose from her chair and went to the shelves. She moved with purpose now, unhurried but certain, the blue jar held in the crook of one arm. She was looking for something specific, and she found it without difficulty. A small, clear glass jar, plain, empty. One she had kept because she kept everything useful. Stoppered with a fresh cork, she set it on the work table beside the mortar and pestle, and her grandmother's note. Then she carefully broke the wax seal on the blue jar. It came away in small flakes, releasing a faint ghost of the dark, complex scent she had caught before. Richer now, more present, the fragrance of those unknown petals, filling briefly the warm air of the room and then subsiding as though they had spoken and then chosen silence again. She removed the cork carefully, tilted the jar, and tipped into her palm a single petal. It was very small, smaller than she had expected, dark as old blood in the firelight, its surface still slightly glossy despite the years of drying, as though whatever quality had made the flower extraordinary had not entirely left even now. She held it for a moment, feeling the dry, fragile weight of it against her palm, light as a breath. Then she transferred it to the small clear jar, stoppered it and set it on the work table where she would see it every day. She replaced the cork in the blue jar, pressed it firmly into place, and dripped new wax over it from the candle she lit at the hearth. The wax was golden, not the old dark red, but it would serve. She smoothed it with a finger and looked at the blue jar for a long moment. Then she carried it back to the step stool, climbed carefully, and returned it to the very back of the highest shelf, to the dark corner where it had waited all these years, where it would wait again for the next one, for the next keeper of this cottage, and this knowledge, the next pair of hands that would learn the language of plants and the long patient work of sitting with those who hurt. For whoever would come after her as she had come after her grandmother, the chain of inheritance going back into a past too green and quiet to see its beginning. The jar would wait. It was good at waiting. She climbed down from the stool and returned to the work table. Her grandmother's note lay where she had left it, the 5 words visible in the firelight, for the one who will know what to do with sorrow. She read it a last time, slowly feeling the weight of the trust in it, the confidence, the love, because it was love, of course it was. This thing her grandmother had prepared across decades and death, this message left in dark glass and crimson petals, and an old woman's careful hand for the granddaughter who would come and sit by this fire and understand. She carried the note to the family Bible, which sat on the mantelpiece as it had always sat, its spine worn and its pages dense with the kind of living that only old books accumulate. She opened it to the flyleaf where her grandmother's name was written, and above it her grandmother's grandmother's name, and above that a name still older. She tucked the parchment note there, where it would be held and preserved, where the next herbalist who opened this book would find it and know that it had been received, that the message had reached the one for whom it was intended. She closed the Bible and returned it to the mantelpiece. The fire whispered on the hearth. The herbs dreamed in their bud. The snow hushed the world outside. The small clear jar sat on the work table, the single dark petal visible through the glass, catching the firelight in a way the blue jar had not, fully visible now, offered to the eye, no longer hidden. It looked, in that warm light, like a small heart, like a small preserved thing that had once been alive and had chosen, in its drying, to remember its living. She would see it every day. She would not forget. She went back to her inventory. There was still the highest shelf to finish. The far side she had not yet reached when she found the blue jar. She climbed the step, stool again, and worked her way carefully along the remaining jars, taking each one down, checking it, returning it. Her movements were slower than they had been at the beginning of the evening, but not with fatigue, with something she might have called gravity or depth, or simply the natural slowing that comes when a person has received something large and is walking carefully so as not to spill it. The last jar on the highest shelf held dried elderflower. the flowers so old they had taken on the colour of old paper. She would not use them. Their virtue was long past, but she held the jar for a moment anyway, with more attention than usual, more presence. Every plant had its time. Every plant gave what it had and then was done. The elderflower had given. It would return to the earth in spring, and come summer the elder tree along the fence would flower again, and she would gather fresh clusters, and the cycle would continue as it had always continued, as it would continue after her. She climbed down from the stool and put it away in its corner. She stood at the worktable for a moment, looking at the clear jar with its single petal, and then at the ranked shelves with their familiar jars, and then at the fire, which had burned to a steady, deep glow. The active flame subsided now to something patient and enduring, the coals orange and red in the dimness. She made her tea. The kettle lifted from the hearth's edge, water poured over chamomile, and a little lemon balm, the steam rising gentle and familiar. She carried the cup to her chair and settled into it with the careful ease of the tired and the content. She watched the fire. The flames were very low now, the light in the room correspondingly dimmed, the jars on the shelves no longer glinting, but simply present in the soft red glow, their shapes familiar and companionable. The herbs overhead had stilled, hanging in the quiet dark above her, patient and fragrant. The dried lavender and rosemary and all the others, each of them a summer's gathering, a season's worth of morning light and bee, sound and the particular smell of the high meadow or the hedgerow where she had found them. They were the summer, preserved and waiting, held against the cold. She thought about holding. She thought about how much of her life had been given over to it, to the holding of things, the holding of remedies in her care, the holding of knowledge in her memory, the holding of a quiet space for those who came to her door in need, the holding of sorrows, not her own only, but all of them, the ones that had been brought to her over decades, set down on her worktable like burdens too heavy for one person, and held here in the cottage's warmth until the person who had brought them was ready to take them back, a little lighter, a little more possible. This was the work. This had always been the work, not the grinding of the mortar, not the measuring of the tisane, though all of that mattered. All of that was real and necessary and took a lifetime to learn. But underneath all of it, the deeper work, the holding, the willingness to sit with what could not be fixed, to offer presence instead of solution, to make of this small warm room a place where the unbearable could be briefly set down and rested from, and then taken up again with a little more strength. Her grandmother had done it, the woman before her had done it, and Elara had done it without ever naming it, all these years. The blue jar on the high shelf waited in its dark corner. The single petal glowed faintly in its clear glass on the worktable. A small dark jewel, a small heart, a small reminder. The fire settled lower. The tea was warm in her hands. The snow went on falling outside, invisible and hushing, pressing the night down around the cottage, like a great hand pressing warmth into cold ground, patient and steady and certain. She thought of her grandmother's face, the long, angular face, the deep-set eyes that missed nothing, the hands that had moved among these same plants in this same room. She thought of the last time she had seen her, already old in the way of great trees, the kind of old that is not frailty but density, the weight of years lived fully, and in full attention to the work at hand. She had held Elara's hands in hers and said nothing. She had not needed to say anything. Everything had been said in decades of teaching, of walking together through the garden at dawn, to observe what had opened and what had closed, of sitting together at this table while the fire burned and the herbs dreamed and the world outside changed and changed and changed, while inside this room something essential and unhurried remained. She had left a jar, she had left a note. She had trusted the work to carry its own message, as the work always did, as it always had, as it always would. Elara finished her tea. She set the cup down on the work table beside the clear jar with its single petal. She looked at them together, the empty cup and the small jar, the two of them ordinary and extraordinary at once, as all the ordinary things were if you had lived long enough in their company to know it. The fire whispered on the hearth, the herbs dreamed in their bundles, the snow hushed the world outside, and the silence held its ancient patience, and the cottage settled into its night, its warm, fragrant, herb-scented night, with the quiet completeness of a thing that has long known its purpose and is content in the knowing. Elara slept, and in the space between sleep and the fire's last ember, her grandmother looked up from whatever she was doing. Some task of the hands, always some quiet task of the hands, and smiled. Not with surprise. She had never been a woman for surprise. With recognition, with the patient satisfaction of a teacher who has waited a long time for a lesson to land, who has placed a jar in the dark and trusted the right hands to find it, who has written 5 words on a piece of old parchment and known, as surely as she had ever known anything the green world taught her, that they would reach the one for whom they were intended. The lesson was received. The jar was found. The petal rested in its clear glass, visible now, no longer hidden. A small dark reminder on the work table where the work of holding would go on. The cottage breathed in the deep of the winter night, fragrant with all its seasons, warm with its long memory, patient with the patience of very old things made slow and enduring by the weight of everything they have known. It held its secrets, it held its remedies, and it held, now, as it had always held, the quiet understanding that some things are not given to be cured but to be carried, gently, carefully in good hands, passed from one keeper to the next like a jar of dark glass on a high shelf, waiting in the dark for the one who will know what to do with sorrow.